All right, for today's speech, we as the House regret the commercialization of social movements. What this looks like is, well, what we all know it to be, whether it's banks at pride parades or Target with Black Lives Matter. There are a lot of social movements that have corporate sponsorship, corporate support in some form or another. This also includes social media influencers. This is fairly common in today's society, and we believe that this is a general negative. What we should be weighing this debate upon today is whether or not the commercialization of social movements is good for the accomplishing of those social movements' goals. Whether this means policy or general acceptance of some viewpoint or some sort of sense of identity, we believe we should weigh today's debate on which side proves they are more successful in achieving the goals of those social movements. Without further ado, I'll get to my points on why the government is winning this mechanism of weighing. First of which is the activist industrial complex. The fact is, when financing, when social media influence, and a lot of clout flows into a social movement, it naturally creates a jobs program and an industry around it. But this is very dangerous because it creates a perverse incentive among the people who work in those jobs. The fact is, people want to keep their jobs. People want to keep the influence and the money they collect. But when it comes to implementing policy, their jobs are reliant on the fact that that issue hasn't been solved yet, that that viewpoint or a sense of identity hasn't been accepted. And therefore, it creates a perverse incentive for those activists and those with corporate and financial sponsorship. And that is, they want to prolong the issue. They want to continue the suffering that their movement is trying to solve. Without solving that issue, they can still keep their jobs. And if they do solve that issue, well, then they're out of a job. This perverse incentive is incredibly damaging because it means that people won't actually work as hard as they can to accomplishing the goals of their social movements. They want to keep their jobs, and because of that, they won't work with the full want of solving the actual issue. The impact of this is, of course, the activist industrial complex tripping over itself and trying to stall progress to ensure that they keep their corporate and financial sponsorships. Social movements want to be successful. They need to be full throttle focused on solving the issues that are at hand through policy that continues to solve the issue once and for all. That is less likely with the activist industrial complex that takes place when corporate and financial sponsorships are in the industry and in the social movements themselves. That brings me to my second point, inoffensive beliefs and corporate moderating. The fact is, many social movements, including very necessary ones, don't always start out as popular. But when corporate and financial sponsorships come into play, what happens is these corporations want to reach the greatest amount of viewers. They want to keep their brand value, their reputation. And that means when corporate and financial sponsorships take place, they naturally have a moderating influence on activists and those who are advocating for social movements. When corporate sponsorships come in, people will say, I really want to keep the corporate sponsorship that I have or the many followers that I have. So I'm not going to speak out against this for this necessary topic. I'm not going to advocate for something that's just outside of my purview. Many activists may support and be the primary advocates of something that's popular, but could also be supporting something that is necessary but unpopular as well. And if they were to branch out, whether it's a boycott against Israel for many advocates or something like that, they could lose those corporate and financial sponsorships and may stay silent on necessary issues. This staying silent on necessary issues means there's less people advocating for necessary social movements. When corporations have the ability to revoke people's sponsorships, people are very wary of this. And because of this wariness, because of this belief in the danger of corporate sponsorship, they are less likely to say the full extent of what needs to be said and will moderate their views, making sure that social movements that are necessary but unpopular are not successful in their endeavors. That brings me to my third point, disingenuous advocates. Once money comes into the play, once social media influence and pop culture fame comes into play, the fact is there will be people in these social movements who are there primarily for money and influence. This is incredibly damaging to these movements. Social movements should focus on advocating for policies and the greater acceptance of viewpoints and identities, but they can't do this if the people who are doing this aren't in it for the right reasons. The fact is, if people are concerned purely about money, they won't advocate as hard for policies. They'll simply take the reputation of the social movement, make sure that everyone says, I support this, I am really great, you should support me, but never actually advocate for policy, taking away oxygen for people who actually want to accomplish the goals of the social movements themselves. This, of course, is incredibly damaging to those movements. If people are not able to properly advocate and in it for the right reasons, then the social movement will fall apart. It'll lose support because no one likes someone who is in it purely for the money. They'll lose the support of the people who they're supposed to be advocating for, whether it's gay rights or the rights of minorities. If people believe that their advocates are in it for purely financial reasons, they're less likely to support them. They're likely to grow despaired and disillusioned with the movement itself. And this is incredibly dangerous because it means that people will not be as passionate and not be believing in the cause that they need to support. Social movements are based on the core of people who truly believe in them, who are willing to go through opposition and willing to go forward when it is unpopular for them to do so. The fact is that social movements require people to be responsive, they require people to be involved in them. So to go over the impacts for today's debate, social movements will be less successful in accomplishing their goals because the activist industrial complex has an interest in stopping progress. Inoffensive beliefs and corporate sponsorship will cause people to moderate their beliefs and not advocate for what's necessary. And third, disingenuous advocates will delay the passion of the movement and will disillusion the greater population and the core of the people they are advocating for with the movement itself. For these reasons, I believe you should vote for the Gov.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I'd kindly like to invite the leader of opposition to open the opposition's case in today's debate. Hear, hear.
The question in this round is, what does commercialization look like on the comparative? We think the government is defending a world where commercialization of social movements didn't happen. This means the comparative is pop culture icons and corporations saying nothing versus something, which means that when they talk about things like corporations revoking their sponsorships later, that doesn't mean a net harm in the opposition world. That means that in their very best case, we just don't get more support. But if there's a high risk that we do get more support, you vote side opposition. I'm going to go down their arguments quick. First, they talk about the activist industrial complex. They say that they'll prolong the issue. Two answers here. One, this is bananas. Social movements don't have a single goal. Gay rights doesn't stop when I have marriage rights. I still have many other goals for my movement to achieve. Black Lives Matter doesn't stop when I get some police reform. I have many other things that I have to address in order to fix the issues in society that my social movement cares about. But second, even then, people who want to work in these industries probably don't do it for profit. The types of people who go into nonprofit versus finance are people who probably have some sort of altruistic motive. So this just doesn't apply. They have no examples of where this activist industrial complex actually occurs. The second argument they make is about corporations and how one, they want to moderate the movement. If I want to moderate the movement, then I just wouldn't support it in the first place. The second argument they make is that they have the power to revoke sponsorships. Two things here. One, what corporation wants to take a positive stance on their environmental friendliness and then say, wait, never mind, and then lose millions of consumers, right? But second, even then, in their best case, maybe we don't get more support, but if there's even a little risk that we do get a lot more support, that is really, really good for the same policy action that OG is talking about. The third argument they make is that this is disingenuous because people do it for money or influence. Even if it is disingenuous, or even if support is diluted, the comparative is that in their world, now no one supports it because they don't know about it, because it's not a national conversation anymore, which means they can't achieve the exact same goals that they're talking about, which is greater acceptance and policy action. What then is the case for the opposition? Our main argument here is that commercialization just gains a lot of support for the movement. When Ariana Grande tweets about how she supports BLM, then even if it's not the most genuine depiction of the movement, the underlying message of the movement is still pushed forward. Okay, what does that mean? That means that the millions of consumers or fans that these celebrities have and the millions of consumers that these corporations have mean that the movement reaches a much wider audience. That means that pop culture icons and corporations have enormous influence over their fan base. So that means that if I support something, then my diehard fan is likely to also want to support that thing. There are like three possible outcomes here. One is that they're more likely to do research about the movement, learn history they hadn't known about before, be like introduced to social or justice organizations they wouldn't have known about previously. Because if I'm never exposed to a social justice movement, and especially if I'm in circles where I'm otherwise unlikely to be exposed to these social justice movements, then I will never have the opportunity to learn and get involved because I just didn't know it existed. The second outcome is that the fan doesn't actually take that much direct action. So maybe they're not getting involved in mutual aid or donating all the time, but they still are more socially aware, which is still a net good, because even if they don't want to go out of their way to drop like $20 on an organization or like go green, they will go out of their way to sign a petition or share posts, because it doesn't really take a lot of their time or energy to do that, but they're still contributing to the dissemination of information about the movement. Ultimately, what this means is it leads to a domino effect where pop culture icons and corporations that have the most social influence not only get millions of their consumers and fans on board, but then those consumers get their friends on board, and then those friends get their other friends on board. This also means that regular people are now given a space to share their experiences with oppression, and generally makes people's lives better when they can use like #MeToo and know that people are listening to them and that they can get support from others. The third scenario is that in the very, very worst case for opposition, these like fans just don't do anything, in which case there's no net harm. But the fact that there's still so much opportunity for a massive benefit is a great reason to vote for side opposition. The second mechanism under this argument then is that when corporations or pop culture icons have a lot of legitimacy, then it's much more taboo to oppose things like BLM or feminism or environmentalist movements, which we think is a good thing, because like OG says, we want these social movements to achieve their goals. I'll stop to take a POI if anyone has one.
I have the POI as a gov. Do you believe that the success of social movements is based primarily on the popular support that they have?
Yeah, that's actually what I was just getting to, which is I want to be very clear that social capital is the key factor behind why a movement works. Everything else is secondary. Like being a really good organizer or being very dedicated to a movement is ineffective if you can't prove to Congress that people support you, or you can't organize in your community in ways that meaningfully affect change. This means that even if this support is diluted in intensity, we would much rather have millions of people support a movement, get a hashtag trending on Twitter, and spark a national conversation about social justice issues than have a few outspoken people talk to audiences of like 10 people. Right? What then is the impact to the social capital? Now we are much more likely to see material change because, one, in terms of grassroots organization, there are more people in your community who now know about mutual aid projects because, like, A, they just know that the movement exists now. B, it's much easier for you as a nonprofit organization, for example, to advertise to people what exactly your organization does and who it supports if it becomes a hot topic in pop culture. And C, like just now your community is just a better place to live in because people are more socially conscious and caring about other people who are suffering because they now know that these are issues that they should be caring about. The second impact to why social capital leads to material change is policy action. This is the thesis of a lot of what OG wants in the first place. Like their ends are policy action and more influence. Only we can achieve that because they give you zero mechanism as to how in their world they're somehow getting more social influence, right? We think that we get more policy action on our side because I'm less likely to get politicians to care about my movement if I don't have enough social capital, because A, if no one knows about it, then it's not an issue that really matters to their election. B, my organization has like less lobbying power if there are less people involved. C, the issue hasn't come into public attention, so politicians aren't really pressured to answer questions of like public scrutiny. And D, voters are now more informed about these social issues and they care more about these social issues, which means that they're probably going to like consider them when they vote in politicians who are going to pass policy action to support these movements. So when OG talks about wanting policy action, you vote side opposition. Okay, the bottom line here is that OG is largely missing the comparative. They say that corporations are going to be disingenuous, or they might revoke their sponsorships, or they might not be good 100% of the time. But even if that is entirely true, even if you take the OG in their very, very best case scenario, all that means is that you don't get any net harm on our side. That just means we live in the exact same world that we're living in right now. But we give you many, many warrants as to how we can potentially lead to a world where we get so much more social capital. And this is honestly probably the truest argument, because if I'm like a celebrity and I'm tweeting out to all my fans that they should go support this movement, it's very, very likely that those fans are going to at least read about that movement and be more socially conscious. Then that means that I'm going to get so much more support behind my movement. I'm going to spark a national conversation that gets politicians to actually care about my movement. But even if it doesn't lead to policy action, I'm getting so many more people on the ground now who want to get involved in grassroots organizations in their communities, which makes the world a better place. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I kind of like to ask the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case in today's debate. Here.
Right. And I'm audible.
Perfectly audible.
Cool. Right. So times. Oh, wait, time. Right. So time starts now. We think that a key thing for you to understand in today's debate is how does social movement achieve its goal? We think that social movement achieves its goal through creating tension, through sit-ins on the street, through protests that the city government can simply not ignore. On their side of the house, they get none of that because most of the social media activism, most of the activism they get from fans is slackerism. This means that they're only like reading the news, but the cost of them getting involved is like in many cases too high. And we think that in our side of the house, because you get this corporate interest into the activist movement, you are also making the activists less willing to be involved in these causes, in these movement, in these like actions that actually create tension, because the cost of them being involved in these like more radical movements, more radical actions becomes higher. So imagine Martin Luther King taking money from like the white moderates, from like white businesses that support him. Will he go on to a freedom march? Will he like be willing to violate the law and get arrested? No, because he's going to lose all that money, and like he's going to like lose all of the like money support, and like a lot of his like a lot of his followers back then would be like in it for the money, and like when he violates the law and like urges people to violate the law, they're just going to lose that support once and for all, and therefore we think that like basically the way in which the opposition talks about social movement is not the correct way in which you like actually achieve goals in a social movement, because you achieve goals in a social movement by creating tension, by pressuring the government into noticing you and into like legislative reforms. Notice that gay marriage in the US was not won because like millions of people are tweeting like gay marriages on Twitter. It is won in a court case. It is won by people who actually have the expertise and have the dedication to like follow through. Like corporate money will inadvertently interfere with this process, because like corporate interest is like a very complex thing. Like a corporation usually it funds like multiple like companies and multiple ventures that in many cases conflict with each other. So for example, like a corporation, for example Zara, like it might fund like a climate activist, but on the other like in a lot of cases the reason why these corporations fund these activists is just to like whitewash its image. Like the corporation does not have an incentive to actually care for the people that your movement actually cares about. In many cases, the corporation just cares about making profit and basically making their image better. And once their image does not become better, they basically ditch you. And then once they, so like what happens once they ditch you? Like why is our mechanism of like corporations revoking support, revoking their support, resulting in a worse world compared to the opposition, right? So the opposition claimed that like once these corporations revoke their money, you are going to get a world that is like basically similar to the status quo. We don't think that's the case, right? So like because like once corporations like revoke their money in support you, we think that what you get is actually reputation damages, because you are seen as like some hypocrite, like you are receiving money from corporations, and now like and now they don't want you to do this, like you stick to your stance, but like but like at the end of the day, you're still like losing a lot of reputation by being inconsistent and also being like not able to like speak for the true causes, right? Right now, I will go down like some of the opposition's argument line by line, right? So firstly, they talk about how like on their side, they're going to get this like wider attention, and on net, this is a net good, right? So like this argument, I already rebutted in my previous argumentation there, because this is not how a social movement actually operates. Like social movements achieve its goal by having a group of like tiny activists who are willing to engage in actions and like protests that actually create tension and force the government to notice them. And we think that this way of getting attention is much better compared to like just having ads, because like when you are just having ads that's like funded by corporation, we think that what happens is that in a lot of cases, your message cannot be too extreme because the corporation in many cases has like other groups of customers too, right? So for example, like it will have like gay customers as well as like white conservative customers. And therefore a corporation would not want to like support a stand of like gay marriage because like it will like basically upset a large group of their like customer base, right? And therefore, we think that in a lot of cases, when corporations support you, inevitably there's going to be a limitation on what things that you can do. For example, if corporations supported like Martin Luther King, like Martin Luther King would never have the chance to engage in like non-violent protests that would basically violate the law, because like no corporation is going to stand behind a person who actually violates the law, because that's basically like against everything that corporations is founded on, which is the current existing system, the current existing structure that functions through the law, right? And therefore we think that their model of achieving social change is basically not the model in which like traditional successful social movement achieve social change. And therefore we think that their model of social movement is actually not going to benefit the groups of people that social movements intend to benefit, which is like people at the very fringes of society and people who are like harmed by like very unpopular harmed by policies that are like majority owned. Okay, so POI.
Don't the successes of recent social movements, for example, the gay rights movement, haven't they happened in the status quo of commercialization, meaning that our mechanisms very much can lead to social change?
We don't think so, because we think that the most meaningful changes that you get is actually through like a very technical and a very expertise way, for example, like winning a court challenge, right? And we don't think like those type of thing, like it is a result of like tweeting this movement, right? Yeah, because like in a lot of cases, like the cost of like these people on Twitter to get into the movement is actually too high, because like they're not going to engage with this protest with you, because like it's going to like it's going to like have legal consequences on them, right? Okay, so like what do you get from opening government, right? So basically opening government gives you a picture of like why the world with like commercialization of social movement is going to be worse, right? So firstly, it's going to like create perverse incentives that allow you that makes people to basically like that gives people an incentive like to like not work enough like to not dedicate fully to the social movement, right? Because like a lot of them will be dependent on this corporate profit to continue their ad campaign, and therefore whenever they want to engage in something that's very radical, it's going to like corporations are going to withdraw their support, and the movement is not going to continue. And also like we think that corporate interests just greatly moderates a movement, and it's not going to lead to the meaningful legislative changes that are oftentimes created through tension, that people violating the law and staging sit-ins. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I'd like to invite the deputy leader of opposition to continue the case of today's debate. Here.
Right. You can put POIs in the chat for me. Is anyone not ready? Okay. I'd like to start my speech by discussing how exactly it is that social movements lead to change. We think that the #1 mechanism by which social movements lead to meaningful change across societies is by increasing popular support. Because no matter how much tension you can create, no matter how many protests you create, if politicians know that the majority of people do not support you, they're not going to act based on your protest, because they know that's going to cost them their political office, since the majority of people are against the social issue, right? So if you take the example of the gay rights movement, yes, it's true that on some level it was legalized through a court case, but at this point in time, the popularity of supporting gay marriage had already passed 50%, and that most people already supported it. That's what enabled this movement to be successful, right? If 70% of Americans don't believe that your social movement has a positive goal, then politicians aren't going to risk supporting it, because that means they're going to very likely lose either their primary or their general election, because that would now be a liability for them. But even if we take my opponents at their best and grant them this idea that that social movements resolve things through tensions and protests, we think that protests are most effective when they have more people involved in them, right? Because the more people you have doing a march, the more attention it gets, the more politicians view it as a threat potentially, and the more like just influence you have in general. And we think the best way in today's age of getting significant numbers of people to participate in your marches is not to have a fringe social movement that has very few followers. It's to be very popular on Twitter. It's to have millions of people engaging with your message through the influence of corporations, through the influence of pop culture and so on. And we think this is by far the best mechanism to lead to significant protests. If you take the example of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, one of the reasons why it was so effective over the last year, sorry, I'll pause time for the tech issues.
Is everything better now? It was good
I
on
just
my
see in
end.
the chat that closing
Yeah,
opposition.
I saw it as well. Yeah. Did everyone pause their timers?
I have
Yes, I
paused the
134.
timer.
CO, could you try moving to a place where you have like a cable connection or closer to the router, or maybe if you're from a phone, to find another source? I think the guide says 2 minutes to wait for this kind of situations. So let's wait. Let's give them those 2 minutes.
Yeah, I have roughly 132.
CO, maybe you could try turning off your camera as well, because that's also taking away your internet speed. Is it better now?
Just 1 sec, like we're literally sorting it out.
We're
Just
just
1
buying
second.
data.
I'm buying more data so I can hotspot the computer. Okay. 1 second. I'm so sorry.
Okay, while we're waiting for them, Inko, you have 2 choices. You could either continue where you left off, or you could restart your speech from point 0. Which one would you prefer?
I think I'll like start like just slightly before where I was when I left off. It's like on that explanation.
So you'll
That makes sense.
continue on the last thing you want to explain.
Yes,
Okay, so we
yeah.
have you at 1:30. We'll continue from 1:30. You're going to explain the same thing that you explained. Okay.
Yeah. Is anyone not ready?
We're just waiting for CO to confirm. CO, are you here? Are you ready?
Also, Ingo, I'll probably give you like a 10-second grace just for the tech issues and stuff.
All right, thank you.
Closing up. Are you okay? I see you that you are here. You're fairly okay on my end. Could you just confirm? They're frozen on my end. I'm not sure how other people see it. Are they frozen on your end as well?
Yeah, same for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm hearing them very well, very cutting off. Um, Brian, what do you advise that we should do? Should we continue? Should we wait a bit more? Your RCA?
That is a very good question. My response to that would be to say I suggest we wait another
was
one.
it OO that's frozen?
Yeah, okay, let's wait till it. CO, are you able to hear us now? Because you were, I think it kind of fixed itself right now.
We're in the same building, so I think that's why we're both having Wi-Fi issues.
Because they are in the same. Okay.
Wonderful, thank you.
Are you able to hear us?
I think they can hear us.
Okay, just CO, turn off your camera because that's definitely taking some of your Wi-Fi and it's pointless.
Okay,
well-
could everyone take off the cameras and maybe that's
Yeah,
going to help in ameliorating
Let's
the problem?
sorry
So I'll
for
do that.
the
Yeah,
trouble.
no
Let's
worries.
everyone take out the cameras.
And secondly, if necessary, we might have to just ask some of the observers to leave in order to lower the bandwidth usage. And if that doesn't work out, then I'll have to think about what to do. Let's hope that works out. Grand.
CO, are you able to hear us now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Let's continue then. Inco, sorry again for this, but online debating, as you know, 1:30. You can start whenever you're ready.
All right, cool. Is anyone not ready?
I think we're all good. So yeah.
All right, cool. So for example, if we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen that one of the reasons it was able to get so much awareness and in fact lead to meaningful reforms in a lot of police departments in the country and lead to a decline in shootings in a lot of police departments was because there were so many people involved in those protests that they were essentially overwhelming and that they needed to get a lot of attention. So while we think that the number one mechanism through which you get meaningful changes through policy on the national level that impacts everyone, the secondary mechanism, which is less important, is still best helped on our side of the house when you have more people involved in all of these protests. With that being said, I want to let's address some of the major arguments in this debate. So first, on some rebuttals. What my opponents are saying, the thesis of my opponent's case is that when a corporation comes and supports some sort of a social movement, and later the social movement does something that the corporation doesn't support, that they might withdraw. And this is bad for the social movement because they're going to be seen as a hypocrite. We think that this is just not correct. If one of your funders is funding you for 2 years and then they stop funding you for whatever reason, one, most people probably aren't going to talk about it that much. Like, I don't know who's funding most current social movements and I'm not aware of that. Number two, if anyone's going to be seen as a hypocrite, it's the corporation that's funding you and then stops funding you all of a sudden when you slightly change your message. So we think that if anything, A, that logic is a reason why corporations won't ever do this, and B, it's not going to hurt you at all, right? If anything, the delta is definitely going to side opposition here, because at least for a few years of your movement, you have a lot of backing that increases your popularity and so on, and increases the amount of money you have and allows you to expand upon your message and attract more supporters. The other thing they say is that you're going to lose corporate support if you violate the law. We think this is very much oversimplified, because we think that a lot of businesses out there actually genuinely support a lot of the social movements that exist right now. And also, this resolution isn't just talking about businesses on the national level saying they support a business or not. It's also talking about small businesses in particularized communities where a lot of people might actually support a social movement, changing their message. And for example, it could be a small business in New York City putting up a Black Lives Matter sign, or as government modeled. So what we say is, in a lot of these specific situations, even if the social movement is considered by society at large as being radical, in specific communities that are more to the that are different in terms of their politics to the rest of society, you still see the positive benefits on our side of the house. All right, then, yeah, okay. Let's go over to some of the arguments that we're bringing up on our side of the flow. So on our first argument about how there's going to be an increase in support, my opponents say that you need a lot of tension and so on in order to actually accomplish things. And we think that these are not, you can still create a lot of tension through a moderate position. Like, if 60% of Americans support things, they can still march in favor of that, and that can still lead to a lot of tension, even though this is technically a moderate position now because a lot of people support it, number one. And number two, I already answered this, that you still need popular support to make things happen. And even if there isn't a lot of tension, if 70% of Americans want something, we think that it's very likely in the long run this thing will actually happen. Amplifying the messages still have positivity here. But with that said, I'd like to introduce an argument of my own in that commercialization of these social movements helps to reach hard to reach populations that have very little trust in other forms of media that would bring awareness to them of these sort of social movements, right? There are a lot of people, a significant portion of the country has very low trust in politicians, very low trust in the media, very low trust in other institutions that are meant to bring them information, right? But they do have a lot of trust in the local small business that maybe provides all the food that they eat all day, or they do have a certain amount of trust in the supermarket that gives them all of the food they need to survive and things like that, right? Like the amount of trust in small businesses in general in societies like the United States is much higher than the amount of trust in government. Like everyone likes to say they support small businesses. And we think that therefore small businesses are an excellent messenger, much better than the media, which is very controversial and viewed in part as partisan in significant parts of the country. This is a much better messenger to spread awareness and spread legitimacy to these social movements. Because when you have a small business in a small town that doesn't have a lot of like political activity, bringing in like a gay pride sign, that sparks a debate within that town about the social movement and increases the acceptability, the perceived acceptability of supporting that social movement. And we think that this is a good thing, especially for the strength of that movement in the long run. At this point, does anyone have a POI they want to ask before I continue?
Closing.
All right, go for it.
Panel, I think it's important to note that in most instances, this commercialization follows the laws and the tendencies of the market that currently exists. Being that in most instances, these are white patriarchal markets, how do you like basically make the aesthetic accessible to the people with that moment is trying to represent?
So the fact that the market as a whole has those characteristics, A, B doesn't mean that all of the small subsets of the market, right, the particular small business who could be owned by someone who is non-white, definitely have those characteristics, right? That's the nature of how markets work. Like the markets are very, very highly like separated, stratified within each other. So we'd say that this definitely doesn't have a major effect there. And B, we still think that it's a good thing when a large business that may be white owned is supporting one of these social movements, because that still increases awareness, increases support for it. The worst case scenario for us is that this business doesn't support the social movement, in which case the status quo and voting for side government don't have a meaningful difference between the two of them. Because if a business doesn't support a movement, it's the same as if no businesses were ever supporting movements. And moreover, the last part of our argument is that these small businesses will be able to tailor their messages to suit the communities that they are a part of in a much better way than businesses at large will, not businesses at large, the movements at large will be able to, because they are so ingrained within their local communities and they understand the intricacies and the specific controversies within these communities. And we think this outweighs in general most of the arguments that government and closing government are going to bring up, because getting this, and if you want to build up large coalitions of people and get the support of all these people, the best way to do that is to reach these hard to reach voters, make sure you get their support and get them voting and get them involved in politics and get them showing up to protests. For all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I'd kindly like to invite the extension speaker from side closing government to open their case in today's debate. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Before I start, as always, the speech is for the Mexican debate circuit. I will start in 3, 2, 1. 3 notes on the counterfactual that my opening decides to ignore. Firstly, I think that in most instances, you can still spread information on social media. This is why the characterization opening opposition about like gun violence is untrue, that we can't have on our side of the house. You can still massify messages. You can still share a lot on the spaces that now we might think is commercial, but commercialization doesn't necessarily entail not being able to like massively share these messages for them to become popular throughout society. I think mostly the characterization that you should understand is that these movements generally do like have some profit incentives, that they create certain aesthetics, that they take people who are particularly famous and they like basically like associate their image with those movements. I think as long as that doesn't generally happen, you can still have many of the things that opening opposition talks about. Second, I think that in most instances, the counterfactual means most spaces and messages being shared by the people of the movement themselves. This looks like having more space on this, even if in our worst case scenario, these are less, for them to be the ones answering in interviews, for them to be the ones who are having more attention regarding the books that they write, regarding the information that they share. Thirdly, I think that in our work, like I think that before you saw commercialization rising in the last few decades, you still had very famous people like just sharing these messages, not necessarily taking these messages as their own. So you probably wouldn't have had them like completely talking about them on their like Instagram, like hypothetically, or like Emma Watson going to the UN, but you can't have them saying, you know what, I support the gay community, like, or the LGBTQ community. I think most of those things are not symmetrical. The extension happens through two things. First, I'm going to explain why the appropriation of these movements are illegitimate and less accessible for some identities, particularly the most vulnerable within these movements. And secondly, I will like mechanize more of my opening's point on how the commercialization makes it harder for movements to achieve social change and the legal change that they aim at getting. So first, why do we believe this is illegitimate? I think that in most instances, as sort of noted by opening opposition, these brands and commercializing entities adopt already developed movements. That is to say that in most instances, these are not the brands who make this, who massify these ideals in society. It is untrue that what opening opposition says is untrue, that they were the ones that made the LGBTQ movements as popular, that they made Black Lives Matter popular. It was rather that society was having those views, and it was profitable for these companies to follow societal ideas because it seems wrong for them not to follow what society is already believing in. The reason why you should care about this mechanism, panel, is because when they do this after those movements already exist, they are instrumentalizing the identities and the struggles of the represented people, of the people that the movement is trying to represent. But why do we believe that it is principally wrong to instrumentalize these identities? I think there is a fundamental lack of recognition of the struggle these people had to go to when you can easily not recognize them as intrinsically valuable entities, but rather as their struggle being the means for you to profit, the means for you as Ariana Grande to get more social capital, without necessarily having to talk about those who are generally more vulnerable. I think if you look at the language and you look at the general campaigns about the entities that we're talking about this motion, they in many instances, not all instances, but in many instances, don't necessarily note, talk about the instances of oppression, but rather say, I just support this movement, Black Lives Matter, but not necessarily talk about the stories of these victims. Might happen, but I don't, maybe with Black Lives Matter, but with most other movements, it doesn't happen. So for example, I don't think that many of these companies really talk about the communities that are being harmed by climate change, by those companies themselves. They just say we want a greener world. More superficial language. I think insofar as they can advance their image without taking care of those things, makes it a very unproportional reaction and intervention within this movement. The second, and this is just no information that my opening doesn't even hint at. The second thing to note is that therefore you make these movements hierarchically ordered, which means that if you're not a profitable movement, you're not tapping into preconceived ideas of what is right for the market, your movement is probably not going to have exposure. Note that this line of analysis is saying that even if everything opposition said is true, the most vulnerable movements probably don't get support. I think that in general, BLM can get a lot of support without commercialization, insofar as most people can empathize going against police brutality, insofar as there are a lot of communities that face this and they can collectively bargain on the streets. So these big movements probably would have had support in either side of the debate to a certain extent. But the smallest movements, these are, for example, indigenous movements in Latin America, who don't get a lot of exposure even in Latin America. These are, for example, movements for transgender movements in Asia and in Africa. I think these movements are the ones who probably don't get any exposure because they are not the ones that sell the most. Right now, these are the ones who are never commercialized on your side of the house, but these are the ones who are seen as even less on your side of the house. So there is an even worse delta because these movements are seen as not as valuable, because if they're not being commercialized by the people you look up to, your singers, your writers, your brands that you love, these are probably not the most important things. Those are not the things I should be caring for. I think therefore this hierarchy harms the most vulnerable, and therefore the delta is much worse on your side. But the most important thing to note here is that you create an aesthetic that makes it inaccessible to many to follow. This is the POI that I make that they fail to respond to. In many instances, you have to continue with certain tendencies that the market already accepts. That is why in Latin America, we do not get clothing supporting indigenous rights movements. We get the same whitewashed t-shirts that say feminist power in our malls. And the reason why this is a problem is because with them not being region specific, you also categorize these movements. Second argument, I want to note how this commercialization makes it harder for movements to achieve the social and legal changes that they pursue. The first thing to note is that, as my opening notes, they intrinsically go for less radical action. I think my opening says this in the types of movement that you select. So for example, whether it's Israel and Palestine or another social movement, I'm going to talk about how within this movement, you don't look for the most radical, legal and social changes. I think because you have to look to a lot more shareholders holders or the image of you as an artist, there isn't enough push against the actors that these companies have deals with. In many instances, this means you are not asking for severe government control, for severe governmental changes, because the government can retaliate against you economically or not give you permits. You're also less radical because other groups seem unnecessary, i.e. my movement as a more conservative one, and this is the link that my opening doesn't give you, makes it so that the other movements, any movement that is violent, is now seen as unnecessary. You could have been just as chill as what we are supporting on our side, but you actively decided to be violent, not that it was a need. Second characterization, and this is a crucial and new one. Most movements in the 21st century, and this has been the trend, and this is why we regret and analyze retrospectively, have been developing to be less centralized movements, like they developed to be leaderless movements. The reason why this characterization matters, from Hong Kong to the Arab Spring to the feminist movements in Latin America to Black Lives Matter, is because you have to centralize your message to get social capital. You have to say, this is what we support. When you have many different entities commercializing, depending on their profit interest, you have a less concise message for society to follow. Therefore, you have more division, less people that are following the same things, and therefore you have less push for the policies that you want to pass. At the end of the day, I think this also means that even the most, like the best people, so like men that want to be allies of the feminist movement, are getting their information from people like Emma Watson, and they don't really know about more radical feminisms. They don't ever have the need of looking for other types of feminism because others are very comfortable. Very, very clear win for closing government.
I think the speaker for those remarks. I'd like to invite the extension speaker from side closing opposition to open their case in today's debate. Here. CO, are you here?
Yeah, I'm just setting up the timer.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. So first of all, I'm going to address a few of the points that are brought up by the closing government, and then I'm going to go into our extension and why we win this round. So firstly, I'm going to talk about their point where they say that when there's a lack of recognition for the key people in the movement when these influencers come in and they take away from the movement, right? So this doesn't actually tend to happen in the status quo. They actually tend to bring to light the key, like people like influencers like Zendaya and stuff like that actually bring to light the key movements, people in the movement, right? Zendaya posting about Breonna Taylor or George Floyd and the BLM movement is not taking away from their contribution to the movement, but more so actually adding to it because more people are now aware of these names and their impact that they've had on the movement. Secondly, they say that the smallest movements suffer, but like, what do we need for a movement to get off of the ground? They need commercialization, they need support. So like these small movements, once they do the foundational groundwork of getting some traction, once they get like allowing them to get some commercialized support will only push the movement further exponentially and will get them to have like a spiral of improvement and a spiral of support from this financial backing, which they don't get on their side. So then these smaller movements end up having to kind of pull themselves through and try and get traction by themselves without financial support. Secondly, they say that they go for less radical action, but isn't this a good thing? Because don't we see in the status quo that radical action leads to delegitimization of the movement, right? When the Black Lives Matter movements turned into like what were arguably riots in the streets, this ended up being bad for the movement itself. But if we have companies kind of putting a restraint on people and kind of saying like, and kind of not threatening, but kind of withholding funds from like movements that choose to do this, then it's going to lead them to doing more like standard protests and standard mechanisms, which leads to a more legitimized movement. So now I'm going to get onto our extension. So what's the goal of a social movement, right? It's to benefit the people who the movement directly wants to represent. The opening is very vague. They talk broadly about social movements and their goals, but we want to talk about the direct impact on the people that the movement helps. And this is why we win this debate. We characterize commercialization as the figures who represent the movement. So like Lil Nas representing the LGBT movement, or as mentioned before, like Emma Watson representing like the feminist movement. And also we want to introduce another nuance. These movements often have like multi-pronged aspects, right? Like there's like trans queers or black queers, and we need to consider these nuance within these movements. So first of all, onto my first point is financial capital. We've already mentioned this briefly, but like social movements need financial capital to run the movement on the ground. We're talking about what the movement looks like on the ground. This provides financial incentives to people who have other obligations. So, for example, a college student isn't going to go out of their way to put up posters or do other things like that for the movement if they have midterms or other obligations. They need some financial obligation to do this. And yes, that this may call to like the genuineness of their like how genuine they are and how much they're like for the cause, but that doesn't really matter at the end of the day because the word is still being spread. And this only happens on our side. Also, money is the biggest limiting factor for social movements actually succeeding, right? If like they don't have money backing them, they eventually lose steam off the ground and they're likely to become more and more deprioritized within people's calendars and people's schedules. They'll initially have a lot of enthusiasm for the movement, but as money and like rewards go down, their prioritization of the movement go down. Now we're going to talk about the pop culture icons themselves and why this benefits them. So like they can use under our world, they can use their difference as the main source of their capital. So like this looks like Lil Nas using the fact that he's gay to promote his music more. This creates more diversity within these industries and creates and opens gates for people who are typically oppressed within these industries to actually enter them. It allows people to monetize their differences. And so it changes it from being a source of oppression to a source of support and a source of income, which is a good thing because this makes Netflix, who are looking to make a new show, or HBO, who are looking to make a new show, more likely to cast these people as they appease to the youth and appease to the people who want to see these movements go forward. This leads me on to my third point, which is there's going to be more diversity and representation in the media, which is a good thing for the people that these social movements want to support. So like a gay teen will see themselves in a Netflix show. They'll see an actor that finally represents them. They'll have a sense of like identity acceptance, and it's going to like reduce this anxiety and tension that they have around their own identity, which is exactly what the movement wants to promote. They want to promote people, they want to promote like the LGBT community wants to promote pride, they want to promote LGBT acceptance. So this starts within the individual. And having more diversity and representation in the media allows for this. It also allows people of similar identities to come together in support. If there's a movie or something that's being created around that casts like an LGBT protagonist, then like people who are in this community can come together in support of this movie, and it allows for this togetherness that really like supports the movement. I'll take a POI from just whoever said POI last.
Panel, I think that the biggest problem with closing is, or with opposition in general, is that even if everything in their case is true, they still don't understand that there's nuances and subgroups within social movements. And that even if society becomes more informed, gives more donations, or is generally better towards these movements, it is always towards the soft part of the movement that this person subjectively decided to support, never the more radical ones, probably never the most vulnerable ones.
Well, it starts off as towards the soft parts of the movement, but as the movement pushes more and more forwards, then we can break into these nuances, but we need financial backing to push these movements forwards. That's why that's why it's better on our side of the house. Also, more this is actually the point that I was about to get onto. More representation addresses these nuances within the movements, right? Like, you're more likely to get a trans actor or a Black protagonist in like generally whitewashed movies. It allows for these more like, it allows for more nuanced representation in like movies and stuff like that, because these are the types of things people are pushing to support. And so for those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I can invite the GovWeb to end it on the GovBench side in today's debate. Here.
Am I audible?
Perfectly audible.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Starting in 3, 3, 2, 1. Note panel that understand that even if all of opening and closing opposition's arguments are true, the impacts that they make to society are incredibly marginal. In their best case scenario, they achieve only two things. One, that you have somehow more donations for these grassroots organizations, which we will tell you why you don't need, and you have more people informed, which we don't think is a big enough impact. Compare that to the arguments that Manuel gives you, right? Principally differentiating ourselves from our opening, how it's principally a huge problem for these corporations to jump in at a time when it's convenient for them, when grassroots activists have done all the work, and when these people have went through all the struggle to completely come in and co-opt the movement. This is a problem because the people who have struggled the most to work for these movements, be that BLM, be that the feminist movement, be that revolutions all across the world, get their work and their struggle taken away from them and packaged onto a social media message by a pop culture icon, by a corporation. We think that the harm that we tell you, retrospectively, what's happened in the past few years because of this co-option and commercialization is far greater than any of the arguments opposition brings. Before I move on to my clashes, 3 and 4 lines of rebuttal, right? First idea, closing opposition comes up with the idea that money is the biggest inhibiting factor and these like organizations lead a lot of money, right? We think you don't need donations from like these corporate swines to be very, very successful. What are some examples of this in the past? For example, the civil rights movement did not have money from Uber or Microsoft and all these companies, yet still very, very successful. Most movements in Latin America, most movements in Asia that don't have popular support in their countries have been able to enact policy change despite the fact that they had support from corporations. The reason that they worked, because they used empathy and the fact that they were people who suffered through these things to empathize and get donations from ordinary people. We don't think that you need money as a big thing from corporations as well. But also understand that when corporations fund these movements, all important all like subgroups within these movements get drowned out, right? That what that means is that, for example, when you have the feminist movement, the only reason someone's going to listen to the feminist movement is when Emma Watson talks about it on Jimmy Kimmel or when some celebrity gets paid to talk about it, right? You're not going to hear the more important, not necessarily the more important, but the more vulnerable messages from groups that are not only more radical, but are facing circumstances that like corporations never talk about, that are not sexy enough to be put in magazines, that are not palatable enough for corporations to use. And the problem here, panel note, is that corporations will only forego and only look at messages that are easy for them to pursue, right? So they will never say stand up against femicide or stand up against genital mutilation. This is how you go to like your congressman and stand up against this. They'll only say being a woman is beautiful, like girl power, things like that. We think those things are very important, but it refutes the idea that grassroots movements are any by implemented. Last idea about how it's going to be more taboo to post against these ideas. This was brought up by opening, right? We tell you, firstly, you can have the stigmatization of these ideas anyway, regardless of, let's say, corporations coming in, right? We exist in a world where the comparative is not zero information about these issues. You can still leverage social media. Grassroots activists can still do that. What we're against is the commercialization of this, right? You can still ban the N-word from being used on Facebook. And you still had that in the past years before social media, before this was all commercialized. And the last idea, when you have stigmatization to that extent, even if it's really, really bad, we think that most people simply won't feel comfortable here, right? Sorry, let me rephrase. What will happen in this case is that there's going to be like a hard degree of stigmatization because most people don't feel comfortable speaking up about it on social media, and people are going to, let's say, and even if you don't use that word, or if you don't speak about that issue because your corporate interests don't let you, your people are going to be stigmatized and you're going to mark someone as a white supremacist only because they didn't speak about this, right? They might not necessarily agree with those issues. Before I move on to the other class, I'll take a POI from opening.
I think it's important to note that we're not saying movements can't be successful without corporate sponsorships, but our stance is they can be much more successful because people like follow celebrities more than they follow a bunch of grassroots organizations. So if in either world, like media organizations won't reach out to grassroots organization then or organizers, why is it worse to have a world where society might not be the most authentic or representing these movements in the most authentic or inclusive way than to have a society where none of them are now like valued by pop culture icons or
The
corporations?
reason it's a problem that authentic issues aren't represented is because these are the real issues that people are facing, right? Most people, low income groups, vulnerable groups, groups that we will characterize that are opening for God to do so, face these issues that are not represented by corporations, right? The problem here is that these groups will be overrepresented by corporations, and the groups that are actually facing these problems will not have full control over the issues that they themselves struggle with, right? For example, if indigenous groups go through specific issues, corporations will never talk about this. If issues of female genital mutilation and honor killings exist in Pakistan or India or South Asia, corporations will never talk about this because it's palatable, and these issues will continue going on. The only conversation that corporations will generate is going to be incredibly marginal and incredibly less impactful than the one that we want to do, right? But why importantly is this really, really bad? We tell you, it's very important to understand that corporations in this case will celebrate the good and just ignore the bad, right? And they'll try to create a picture of a picture perfect world because they won't want to get a negative image out there. What are very concrete examples of this, right? For example, in the past month, in the past year, when you had the Gay Pride month coming in, lots of companies changed their cover photos to represent gay pride, right? But understand that these corporations and these celebrities have like different sorts of customers. While they may have liberal customers, they also have tons of conservative customers, right? In different segments. What that means is when Microsoft, Uber, Ubisoft, BMW, all these corporations virtue signal that they cared for like these movements, they only did that in their North American Instagram page, never in their Middle East Instagram page. They don't care about issues where they don't care about people where these issues are more rampant. But also understand, as a final example before I tell you, the reason we take this not against just opposition, but also our closing, is because we tell you what these vulnerable groups look like. It's indigenous minorities, it's the BLM movement, it's the feminist movement, it's all these people. But on their side of the house, they're having a world where corporations can just pay Kendall Jenner to give a police officer a can of Coke and solve like BLM, right? We don't think that's the world we want to live in. We want to focus on the crux of these issues and instrument policy change that can only happen through grassroots activists. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I kind of like to invite the Opwhip to end today's debate. Here.
Absolutely.
Okay, am I audible?
Yep. Well, currently you're muted.
Muted?
Muted?
Yeah, on my end, I see you as muted. It's very weird.
Oh,
And now you're freezing. Do anyone see it the same way?
No, I don't think they're muted.
I don't think they were muted. Oh, there we lost them.
Maybe you could stop your camera.
Um,
Brian, what do you think? Maybe we should tell the observers to leave to stop the bandwidth.
I'm not entirely sure what's going on with the tech, but let's give them another 30 seconds. Okay, if it doesn't work out, we might have to ask the observers to leave. Yes.
Okay, CO, are you able to hear us?
I just typed it in the chat box. It's possible they can't hear audio but can see the chat. So
Yeah, thanks. Well, on my end, I see them as having low connection.
Technology. I hate technology.
Closing opposition. Can you hear us? Oh,
I think they're back.
can you hear us?
yep, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so audio is fine.
Yep, audio seems fine.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna leave the camera off then, and I will be taking POIs in the chat. Move up. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, at this point in the debate, I'm just really confused by the extension that we get from closing government. And the main reason I'm confused is because it's painfully uncomparative. Because they tell us that like indigenous communities are going to be really badly harmed on our side and never do any analysis to show why that's any different from the status quo. Before getting into that though, let me deal with our extension, which they barely responded to. What did Selma tell you in her speech? The first argument she gave you was about financial benefits. And she gave you a distinct piece of analysis that we don't get from our opening half here. She said that what social movements actually need is money, right? Money to make sure their protests happen, money to make sure that you can like bust people into the Black Lives Matter protest from like different states. And that even if people are very passionate, the main reason that social movements usually fail, and they can't just like cherry pick examples and say that social movements are sometimes successful, the main reasons that the ones that closing government doesn't mention that aren't really well known is because they didn't have funding, they didn't have resources, and they were like kind of lost to history, and we don't know about them in the status quo. The impacts of this argument, or that we have more longevity for social movements and we have social movements that are able to create more action. The only response they give us here is an appeal to history where they say, yes, it's possible for a social movement to succeed without having masses of corporate funding. One, sure, that's true, right? Social movements have existed before. Just because they existed doesn't mean that they were operating at optimal efficiency. We think it's better on our side of the house. Secondly, we say that they simply cherry pick examples of really massive social movements. We'd say that we could equally say that in history, right, during the Stonewall riots, people didn't have enough money to bail their LGBTQ like comrades out of jail because they were under fucking funded, right? So they can't simply like claim that like Martin Luther King existed and therefore our case is kind of a wash. Second argument that was completely unresponded to that Selma gives you is about pop culture icons. She gives you analysis here about how usually like queer celebrities or celebrities that fully embody their identity are kind of suppressed. When they're able to monetize their identity in the same way that like cisgender and white celebrities or actors are able to do, these people get more airtime, they have better lives, they have better careers, and ultimately they're on screens representing like minority communities to the like young people within those communities. We think that's ultimately better. Thirdly, she gives you a distinct argument about representation, how it's inherently good to see Lil Nas X performing at the Grammys if you're a young gay Black teen living in a homophobic neighborhood. Completely no response. What are the impacts of our extension? Firstly, we tell you about inherent functionality of social movements. Secondly, we tell you about longevity. And thirdly, we tell you that we like help the people that are most vulnerable in this debate. Then let's deal with the uncomparative extension that we get from closing government. The first thing they tell us here is that, look, they tell us about like the first response they give us here is about kind of like pragmatic harms. And they say that the social movements that companies are likely to be supporting are social movements that are already well developed, right? They already have a lot of followers. Couple responses here. Firstly, we'd say, yes, that's true, but those movements still have gains to make, right? Black Lives Matter is really popular. Black people are still oppressed in the United States. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and they can benefit from having deals with Nike. Secondly, we say that as this becomes a marketing trend, movements are more likely to kind of fund less, companies are more likely to fund less popular social movements because it's a marketing trend, right? This looks like Nike sponsoring Colin Kaepernick, even when he was in the middle of an NFL lawsuit, because like this has become a marketing trend and they knew that this plan wouldn't ultimately backfire them. They were appealing to their audience. So sure, companies are malicious, capitalism sucks. That doesn't mean that we can't take advantage of it like people who are already privileged in society do. Let's deal with their second argument that they try and impact a lot but don't really provide mechanisms for, which is about how the most vulnerable people are not going to get support. They're talking about like indigenous communities and people that are like at the intersections of oppression and they're really struggling. Couple responses here. Firstly, we already give you a mechanism about how as this becomes more of a marketing technique, these smaller communities are likely to be more supported. So when businesses see that like supporting a social movement is like a good marketing strategy, they're likely to branch out into smaller movements. Secondly, and most importantly, why is it better on your side? If nobody is listening to indigenous communities in the middle of Brazil, then why are they going to be listened to less on our side of the house? They never give us analysis about how we crowd out these communities in any way. We say even if we take them at their best case scenario, they are simply no better than the status quo, and like this is a wash in this debate. These communities are not being listened to on either side. Thirdly, we'd say that actually it's, am I still audible?
You're still audible.
Sorry.
Can-
Okay. I just paused my timer. Sorry, the internet connection stopped. I paused at like 4:40. Can I
You
carry
can
on
continue.
from there?
You can
Okay.
continue, yeah.
Continuing in 3, 2, 1. Thirdly, it's actually better on our side of the house because when you have some engagement with the social movement, you're likely, okay, so this is when we're talking about movements in which so for example, the feminist movement, there are many different types of people within the feminist movement and some are more disadvantaged than others. When you have some engagement with a movement such as the feminist movement, you're more likely to engage with the people that are most oppressed. When you hear Emma Watson talking about feminism, you're less likely to ridicule Black feminists. Sure, you don't have a Black feminist on Jimmy Kimmel talking about Black feminism, but we say that you're more likely to engage with those people in the future. The comparative on their side is simply a situation in which you don't engage in feminism at all because they don't give us mechanisms about how these social movements are going to achieve on their side, aside from appeals to history with no analysis. Let's deal with the third thing they give us, which is about the centralization of social movements and how decentralized social movements are really bad. Before that, I'll take a POI.
No, their point on you using your identity to profit, the underlying concession there is that you should be able to use your identity yourself. That is why when Emma Watson or other people use your identity for themselves, the principal harm is that you don't control the narrative over your own struggle, which happens on our side when you are the ones in those interviews, when you are the ones in those programs, when you control the narrative completely, you say how you want to be represented. That's what the comparative that they don't answer.
I think the issue here is they don't understand that the types of celebrities that are going to be on Jimmy Kimmel are in that movement themselves, right? Emma Watson, shockingly, is a woman. So she's using her own identity. Her using her identity does not attract from me being a woman as well. Let's deal with the third point about centralization. Firstly, we'd say that social movements are inherently decentralized anyway. Secondly, we'd say that decentralization is actually good because it creates more nuance, right? So when you have Black feminism as well as queer feminism, as well as trans feminism, that's really nice because I get my own community that I can really engage with. And thirdly, we'd say that decentralization doesn't harm the efficacy of the movement because you can have an umbrella movement, right? So all different types of queer people can go to Pride, even if they may not be they don't all need to be the same. They can still engage with the movement as a whole. Ultimately, they wanted to create impact about how they're harming how we harm the most vulnerable person. They don't show why they're simply distinct. Let's deal with our opening government then. They gave us one, okay, I actually don't have time for that. Let's show you why we're distinct from our opening half, right? So opening half tells us that they're going to create policy change and that these movements will become more widespread on their side of the half, on their side of this debate. We extend this by showing you that functionality is based on money and that we actually create better policy change. Ultimately, yeah.
Great, I think